close collaboration with the Public Health Foundation of India and with researchers at the Kalinga Institute for Industrial Technology in Bhubaneswar. So we very much work with our fantastic Indian colleagues. The work that I'm going to present falls under a research program that I lead at the London School called CHEFS, which stands for Sustainable and Healthy Food Systems, and that work is very generously supported by the Wellcome Trust. I'd like to start by dedicating this talk to our dear friend Prakash Shetty. I met Prakash for the first time more than 25 years ago. He was my teacher, he was my mentor, and he became my very close friend. He died in September this year, and we miss him terribly. So the outline of my talk, I'm going to cover 5 main areas. The first, I'm going to talk about the nexus between food systems and the environment. How are these two things linked and in what ways? I'm then going to talk about the impacts of environmental change on the food system. I'm then going to flip it around and talk about the impacts of the food system on the environment. I'm then going to have a focus of some research that we've been doing for the last 5 years in India on this nexus between the food system and the environment. And then I'm going to look at some future challenges. So first of all, to start with this question, what's the link between food systems and the environment? And I'd like just to remind everyone what I mean by a food system. So the food system goes from the farm to, this is the production of food on the farm, the processing of foods, the storage and transport of foods, the sale of foods in shops, the marketing and sale of foods, the cooking of foods in the household, the consumption of foods in the household or outside the household, of course, and the throwing away of foods. That all falls under the general term of food system, as well as, and this is very important, the policies, resources, and institutions that shape and influence the food system. So what are the links then between the food system and the environment? Well, if we start off with our food system at the top there, which generates the foods and diets that we want to eat, and therefore the health of nations, individuals and nations. And as nutritionists and nutritional epidemiologists, we spend an awful lot of time focusing on that little piece of the puzzle, the links between foods and diets and health. Increasingly, we're recognizing that foods and diets come from a very large and very complex food system. And many of the talks we had this morning were fantastically, identified the enormous amount of work that is now going on in agriculture, for example, in food processing, which is all forms part of the food system. But the environment has a critical role to play in shaping the food system and the ability of the food system to generate those foods and diets. A healthy environment will enable the food system to generate more food than an unhealthy environment. And of course, at the same time, the food system, because of the fact that food is grown in the environment, the food system itself has a substantial impact on the environment. And I mentioned that briefly in my opening comments on the first day of this conference, that understanding the impact of the food system on the environment and the unintended, frequently unintended consequences of our actions in the food system on the environment is increasingly important. And then an area I'm not going to discuss today very much is the direct links between the environment and health. And one area of particular and increasing importance is just heat. If the temperatures, for example, in India reach 45 degrees on a regular basis, as they are now in the summer seasons, it's going to be incredibly difficult to do any agricultural labor. Not only will the plants not grow, but it will not be possible to work. And the consequences of that direct impact of environmental change on health are going to be tremendous. And that's, I mentioned on the first day, that triangle that we use a lot in our work that links these 3 important domains, the environment, the food system, and health, and that forms the focus of our work. So how will a changing environment affect food production? And I'm going to assume that you know a little bit, but maybe not all there is to know on this topic, and I'm going to run through a few slides just to talk about this. So first of all, I hope you will all know that global temperatures are changing, And we had a very important report about a month ago from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which told us very clearly that it's almost impossible that we will not increase temperatures by more than 1.5 degrees by 2030. So global mean temperatures are on the rise. We have so far done almost nothing to stop that, and there's no evidence that we're going to do anything to stop it in the near future. So global temperatures will rise by at least 1.5 degrees by 2030, and predictions for the future are of course for much greater rises in temperature. There will also be, there are projections, many projections on the change, and you will have noticed this here in India particularly, changes in global precipitation, the amount of rainfall, where it rains, how often it rains, what types of rain you're going to receive. There are many parts of India I know that suffer from substantial droughts, and this is going to become, the predictions are that this will become an increasing consequence of environmental change. So what's the impact of those two very major environmental changes on the food system? Well, most work to date has been done on cereal yields, the yields of the major cereals on the planet, and this is a report from 2010. There are more up-to-date data, but they all show exactly the same thing, which is that cereal yields globally are predicted to decline quite substantially, but not everywhere. And this is a very important point that I'm going to return to later. Cereal yields will decline in hot countries. So in Africa, in South Asia, in South America, in Australia. It's going to be impossible to grow anything in Australia quite soon. So in the hot southern countries, there will be substantial declines, and they're estimating 10 to 15% declines in yields in many countries in the south. In the global north, this is Canada, Russia, Northern Europe, there will be increases in cereal yields because the temperature will be much more favorable for the growing of cereals. The consequence, of course, is therefore a global imbalance in where cereals are and where people are. What do we therefore need? We need thought on how we move vast numbers of, where we have two options, I suppose. We can either move vast amounts of cereal from the north to the south, or we could move large numbers of people from the south to the north. But one of those two things clearly has to happen. There's also some very interesting evidence recently published as part of our research, although we weren't involved in doing the analysis, but it came under a grant that I ran, on the quality of cereals. You will know that carbon dioxide is an important substrate for plants, and increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will lead to increased growth of plants, and the increased growth of the cereal, the kernel, of course, will lead to a decline in the concentration of nutrients in those kernels. And so this is a very well-known effect. It's called the carbon dioxide fertilization effect, and so the increased growth of the cereal grains leads to a decline in the nutrient content, and there, as you will again see, the countries at most risk of declining cereal contents of their grains are the poor countries of Africa, but also South Asia. Much of the focus, as I said earlier, has been on cereals, and I know in this conference we've focused a lot on fruits and vegetables, which is important, and as a nutritionist, of course, I'm passionate about fruits and vegetables, so I'm always rather disappointed at these conferences that all these people put up these lovely photos of fruits and vegetables, but you can't taste them. And I'd love it if at future conferences, as well as showing the pictures, you can have a sort of smorgasbord of vegetables for us to eat. That would be lovely. But our focus, therefore, as nutritionists, because they play, vegetables and fruit play such an important role in human health, is to look at the impacts of environmental change on things other than cereals. And we've conducted 3 major systematic reviews on the impacts of environmental change on vegetables and legumes, on fruit, and on nuts and seeds. The first of these papers has been published, and I'll show you the results now. And the second one is under review, and the third one's in final write-up. And we looked at both the evidence from, we did major systematic reviews of all of the experimental evidence, looking at what happens if you change environmental parameters on the yield and the quality of vegetables and legumes. I'll focus on that one. And we looked at 5 major environmental parameters, carbon dioxide, temperature, water, ozone, and salinity. And the results are published in PNAS earlier this year, and the results are pretty alarming. So our estimates from the combination of, so bringing together all of the available evidence for vegetables and legumes, are that there will be carbon dioxide fertilization effect will again have an impact on increasing yields, but for high temperature, for low water, for high ozone, and for high salinity, there will be substantial declines in yields. We estimate there will be a substantial decline in yields with those environmental changes. We found very little evidence, there's insufficient evidence to make any solid statements on the quality of fruits and vegetables with regards to their, vegetables and legumes with regards to their nutritional quality. And just to focus a little bit on that carbon dioxide fertilization effect, many of these studies were done with single environmental changes, one at a time. A few studies were done where environmental changes were combined, and in almost all of the studies where increased carbon dioxide was, there were changes in carbon dioxide at the same time as changes in water or changes in temperature, that carbon dioxide fertilization effect was attenuated or removed altogether. So the carbon dioxide fertilization effect seems to occur only in the laboratory rather than in real life. And of course we know that rising CO2 levels are happening exactly the same time as rising temperatures and declining rainfall. So that's the links between environmental change and foods and food systems. What about the other direction? How does the food system affect the environment? So here we have my schema again of the food system. And at every single point there, you can imagine that there are going to be environmental effects on the farm, whether it's the use of manures or fertilizers or the amount of water in the processing, plastics and glasses and the fuels used. At every single stage, you can imagine environmental effects. And some of those are, of course, quite large. So the effect we talk about most in this field is greenhouse gases, and they're an enormous, agriculture is an enormous source of greenhouse gas, and it's estimated, we heard on Sunday, that somewhere between 20 and 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. We know that water is, of course, especially here in India, and the focus of a lot of our work is on water. Agriculture uses huge amounts of water, and it's estimated that something like 90% of ground and surface water use in India is in agriculture. We haven't talked much about soils at this conference, but soil and soil degradation are major changes that are resulting from intensive agricultural activity. And finally, land use change and habitat loss. I now work with some absolutely fantastic global leaders in biodiversity, Professor Dame Georgina Mace at University College London and others. And there are real concerns about the impact of land use change on biodiversity. And I haven't mentioned, of course, that, that there are considerable concerns about biodiversity loss globally and pollinator loss globally and the impacts of that on agriculture. So you can see that agriculture has a substantial impact on the environment, but all of those impacts are not equal. And there was a very nice paper published in Nature by Marco Springman from the group in Oxford just a couple of weeks ago, which looked at those various different environmental impacts now and predicted to 2050, and estimated for greenhouse gases, for cropland use, for water use and other things, what those, how those impacts would change between now and 2050. And you can see from the graph here that the impacts will continue to change, will continue to be quite large. It's estimated, for example, if all things stay the same, that greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture will almost double by 2050. And that's, of course, to do with what we want to eat. So the red bar there is animal source foods, which are a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, but also the number of people on the planet. So there are going to be substantially more people on the planet, of course, and some of these impacts are going to grow tremendously. So that's the gloom and doom side. But what about solutions? So there are two sort of main buckets of solutions: agricultural and behavioural. So we've heard some fantastic talks about the sorts of agricultural interventions that can be employed to mitigate or adapt to environmental changes. So we have here pictures of drip irrigation. The second one there is vertical agriculture, which is increasingly happening in urban centres. And then finally here we have scuba rice, which is a very nice example of rice varieties that have been bred to withstand environmental stresses. Those are sort of, and that's just a very small set of examples, but then also behavioral changes might need to happen. We might need to think about eating different varieties of foods. We've heard a lot over the last few days about different varieties and the enormous number of varieties that are available, and maybe we should be choosing varieties that are more resilient or have lower environmental impacts. We might need to think about eating different types of food. Many people around the world already eat large numbers of insects, and there are increasing, and we heard some research earlier at this conference about that, but there are also increasing amounts of research on protein from insects. And finally, I've put a picture of a burger up there, but that's not any old burger. That burger cost £250,000. That burger was grown in a laboratory, in a Petri dish. So we might not only different types of food, but we might need to think about different ways of making food, and that might be a solution for the future, although I somewhat doubt it. So agricultural and behavioural solutions, there are many which we need to be thinking about, but we also need those climate, trade and equity policies that I mentioned earlier that are going to be so important to face the future. Unfortunately, we also need leaders who understand this, and at the moment we're somewhat challenged by our choices in some of our leaders. I've done some of this work firsthand. I've been very fortunate, and this was work that I did with Prakash Shetty as part of the LANSA consortium, which is the Leveraging Agriculture for Nutrition in South Asia consortium. And the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai, I've been working with them for the past 6 years, and they have a fantastic program called Farming Systems for Nutrition, which carries out research in Koraput and Wardha, looking at the different nutritious crops, drought-resistant and resilient crops, cropping practices, changing, intercropping and other things to improve productivity. There's a large focus on genetic gardens, so that knowledge, that indigenous knowledge of the various enormous biodiversity that's available isn't lost, and then focuses on livestock and fish as well. So this LANSA program was a 6-year program funded by the British government. It's now completed, and there is now a special issue in food policy, which is about to be published, will be published in the next week or so, which summarises the work of LANSA, and I hope you'll find that of interest. So then turning to specifically to the situation in India, and I'm going to run through some of the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years. First of all, defining the challenges. We have a growing population, of course. There's substantial dietary change. Both of these products here cost 100 rupees in Delhi. I know which one I'd rather eat. There's substantial groundwater depletion, and I'm going to be focusing on that a little bit in the rest of the talk. And then, of course, very big concerns about climate change, whether it's rainfall, availability of water, temperature. For this work, we used data from the Indian Migration Study, which was a study funded by the Wellcome Trust and conducted by the London School in 2006. So the data aren't particularly new, but I'm trying to demonstrate a method for how to do this sort of work. So the Indian Migration Study was a very nice study published in PLOS Medicine, where data were collected on adults from four centres down the spine of India. And we have dietary data on 7,500 adults living in both those cities and the surrounding countrysides. And we used latent class modelling to identify dietary patterns within the dietary data sets, and we identified 5 quite distinguishable dietary patterns within the data set. One pattern was predominantly rice, but had relatively low dietary diversity. One pattern had rice and quite a lot of fruit. One was rice and a mixture of meat, and you won't be surprised that was from around here. One pattern was contained wheat with lots of pulses, and one pattern was wheat, rice, and oils, mixtures of. So there wasn't a dominant cereal, there was a mixture of both wheat and rice and quite a lot of oil. And the people that consumed these 5 different patterns were of course different, so the rice and low diversity diet tended to be poorer people living in the countryside, and the wheat diets were of course northern, more likely to come from the north, and diets with meat in tended to come more from urban centres than from rural. And so the dietary patterns split into these sort of quite regionally, but they allowed us to do some analysis then. Having defined those diets, we were then able to do some analysis on the environmental footprints of those diets. So first of all, we calculated with Pete Smith, who's the world leader on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. He sits in the University of Aberdeen. We calculated the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those various dietary patterns. And you can see that the rice and low diversity diet and the rice and meat diets had substantially higher greenhouse gas emissions than wheat diets, wheat-based diets. And I put up the UK diet there so you can see that every single Indian dietary pattern has a much lower greenhouse gas emissions than the UK diets. And then we calculated in a subsequent paper the blue water footprints. So blue water is the water drawn from either surface or groundwater. So it's not rainfall, it's either groundwater or surface water. And you can see that there's an inverse relationship there. So the wheat patterns have a much higher blue water, and the rice patterns have lower blue water, and of course that's not enormously surprising. Wheat is irrigated and rice is rain-fed, so it's not that surprising. But you can see, therefore, when you do this analysis, that it identifies trade-offs, and it identifies not only that there are differences between patterns in dietary patterns in environmental footprints, but also that there are some trade-offs, and you need to decide, do I care about greenhouse gas emissions, or do I care about water? And of course there are 15, 20 different environmental parameters that we could consider. We're now doing work on biodiversity, we could do work on nitrogen, we could do work on many other environmental patterns of interest. We then decided to do some optimization, and I've called this an experiment, because of course it's all modeling, so it is really an experiment, thought experiment. And we decided to optimize these dietary patterns so that they would meet the projected declines in the availability of blue water due to population growth. So as the population grows, and the amount of blue water stays relatively the same, or in fact declines, what will happen, so every individual therefore has less per person blue water, and how do you optimize diets to reduce their impacts? The optimized diets all met the national dietary guidelines, and they minimized deviation